In this final session, I want to clarify this misunderstanding by offering what I take to be a correct account of aesthetic autonomy. At its core, the autonomy of arts refers to the idea that art deserves a protected space. By protected space, I don't mean the obvious safeguards needed to preserve artworks from vandals and the overly curious, but as railing, velvet roofs, and alarm systems. Nor do I mean a domain cut off from the social and political world. If we interpret autonomy as a demand for a political of or otherwise disengaged art, we will be right to reject it. By protected space, I mean the principle of granting artists control over both their subject matter and means of expression. It is this figurative space that is the space in which artists can work without outside interference, which the literal space of the museum and gallery concretely embody. Historically speaking, the idea that artists deserve such control in recent the separation of artistic institutions from institutions of church and state did not occur until the 18th century and new primarily in Europe. In the past, artists were not granted independence. What then explains the modern view that artists deserve independence? What is the basis of the idea that this independence ought to be protected? One source of this idea, of course, is the liberal democratic conception of individual liberty, whereby artists, like everyone else, have a right to individual expression. It is this concept of individual expression that is embedded in the American Constitution. So artistic liberty can be protected by appealing to constitutional guarantees. Here, the independence of art is simply a consequence of constitutional projections of free speech. An appeal to the First Amendment does not, however, distinguish art from any other form of expression. It thus cannot explain the idea that artists deserve special protections. The demand for special protections rests on the institution that art is not just any kind of expression. In burning all the existing copies of The Grave of Words, we lose more than just Steinbeck opinions. In seeking an explanation for the idea that artists deserve special protections, we might to look to a concept of genius that has its root in Kant, namely the view that artists possess an inborn imaginative talent that enables them to see in ways others cannot. In this conception, the genius has a natural capacity for originality, for breaking with tradition and making his or her own rules. Romantic tradition comes to understand artistic vision as transcending ordinary experience or penetrating beneath into a realm deeper or more primordial than ordinary reality. The artist becomes a godlike visionary or even a mad genius, who is due extraordinary indulgence. From this problematic perspective, the talent of Gauguin or Van Gogh exempt them from the normal demands of family life or social responsibility. Basing the argument for the special protection of art on the madness of the artistic is vulnerable to the objection that such madness deserves not more liberty but less. However, the argument for special protections needs only the assumption that artists possess talent and training that make them capable of showing us that we might not otherwise see or see clearly. This is a conception of genius, but it is a modest and indeed a familiar one. Artists may not be the only people who can do these things, but if we accept the artists are specially equipped, technical and imaginatively to help us see things, then they naturally have a special social role to play. They can function as critics, reformers, revolutionaries, or even as defenders of unappreciated aspects of the status quo. Historically, of course, artists have often served these functions. Seen in this way, art has a high social value. It makes us think twice, think different, relive the past, imagine the future. It is this social value, not the mad genius of its makers, that warrant protection according to the principle of autonomy. It's allowing art the independence to function in these ways. We seek to protect a political good. What does it mean to grant the principle of the autonomy of art, and what are the consequences of doing so? Well, one thing it means that where artistic and government interests conflict, the presumption should be in favor of the artist. The autonomy of art, properly understood, takes this principle as fundamental, but is not absolute. You can have yourself shot and wounded in the service of art, as Chris Burden did in a performance piece entitled Shoot, but you can't expect the government to sit still while you have someone else shot. The point of advocating autonomy is not, as Elms and his supporters have charged, to grant artists absolute license, but rather to make it clear that in case of conflict, the presumption should be in favor of the artist. One important consequence of granting the principle of the autonomy of art is that we cannot demand that the government impose our own partisan agendas with respect to art. Thus, we cannot consistently endorse autonomy and also pass legislation requiring that publicity-funded art promote conservative family values. Nor could we endorse laws prohibiting palocentric works of art. So far, there is a little in this account of autonomy to which traditional aestheticians will object, but what of the feminist objection that adopting autonomy commits us to a non-political conception of art? Does an autonomy go hand in hand with formalism? I want to end by suggesting that the principle of the autonomy of art, properly understood, does not commit us to formalism. Of course, autonomy does not prelude formalism. It does not, however, require it. One can both insist on the importance of a protected space for art and maintain that an apolitical, disengaged art is undesirable. There is no inconsistency here. Indeed, one good reason for endorsing the principle of autonomy is precisely because one thing art has a political function, because one thinks the kind of independent critical voice art often provides this worth protecting. Thus, a political conception of art need not leave art unprotected against political interference, nor, I might add, thus commitment to a political conception of art require that criticism becomes solely the assessment of the ideological import of art. One can allow that art has political content and that its content is important in discussing and evaluating it without giving priority to political considerations, as Helms does in dismissing artistic questions in favor of judgments about decency. Politics does have an explicit role to play in evaluating art, but we need not determine the political value of art simply by the content of the work, in ignoring not only Mapplethorpe's style but also the interrelationship between his photographs and the context in which they appeared. Helms part ways with both formalism and the far more sophisticated politics of art advanced by feminist critics like Linda Noshling, Lucy Lippard, Rita Felsky, and others. Their work demonstrates how political criticism can take stylistic innovation and the changing meaning of the textual forms into account. In valuing creativity and the stylistic values of art, these feminist theories are closer to traditional aesthetics than one might initially suppose. This is not to say that political conception of art run the risk of reducing criticism to politics, but it is to say that we now have examples of sophisticated feminist criticism that point in the direction of a politics of art that is not reductionist. In sum, I have argued we need not accept the narrow critical contrasting of formalism in order to guarantee artistic liberty. The autonomy of art, properly understood, does not require formalism. We can banish formalism and still protect art and artists from political interference. And given that we can, we should.